So it's a great joy for me to introduce the conversation partners this morning. Firstly, Brandon Scott. Brandon is the Dartmouth Distinguished Professor Emeritus of New Testament at the Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He's a charter member of the Jesus Seminar. He's chair of the Westar Institute's Christianity Seminar, and he served as chair of the Bible in Ancient and Modern Media section of the Society of Biblical Literature, as well as a member of several of their seminars, including the Parables Seminar, the Historical Jesus Seminar. Brandon's the author and editor of many books, including The Real Paul, Recovering His Radical Challenge, and The Trouble with Resurrection, along with my two favourite go-to books on the parables, Hear Then the Parable and Reimagine the World. Brandon is a keen birder. Depending on where you are in the world, that might be a bird watcher or a twitcher, a keen birder and photographer. And it's terrific that you could make some time to be with us this morning or this evening where you are. So thanks, Brandon.
Delighted to be here.
Also like to introduce Greg Jenks. Greg is an Australian religion scholar and an Anglican priest who's about to retire as Dean of Grafton Cathedral in New South Wales. He's an adjunct senior lecturer in the School of Theology at Charles Sturt University. He was one time Dean of St George's College, Jerusalem, and academic dean at St Francis Theological College in Brisbane. He's a fellow of the Westar Institute and served as its associate director from 1999 to 2001. Greg's written a number of books, including The Once and Future Bible, The Once and Future Scriptures, Jesus Then and Now, and Wisdom and Imagination. And I've known Greg since I first began my theological studies back in Adelaide, back in the early 90s. So it's terrific to have you with us as well, Greg. So thank you for making time.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Good to be here.
So Brandon, I wonder if you could begin perhaps by giving us a sense of where this book came from. Because it seems to me it fills a bit of a gap where not much has been written between the time of the life and ministry of Jesus and the 3rd and 4th century when Christianity really began to take off. So perhaps you could talk to us a bit about where the book came from.
Yeah, I actually started the seminar twice. The first time was shortly after the Jesus Seminar completed its work, and I wanted to do a seminar from Jesus to Constantine, and I made a proposal. We got it started, and Steve Patterson took it over, and it went on for 3 or 4 years, and it just kind of petered out. We couldn't see how to make it work, mainly because it's hard to talk about the 1st and 2nd century. As you said, it's really easy to start to talk about the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century because you have a lot of data. The 1st and 2nd century are much more difficult to talk about. So after that seminar kind of collapsed about 10 years ago, I tried again, and this time I cut the dates down. I decided to go to 212 because that's when every free male becomes a Roman citizen, and that kind of changes the dynamic of what it means to belong in the Roman Empire. And so we reorganized the seminar, and we reorganized it along a study of the social organizations. How did these people organize themselves socially? And how did they work as groups in the first 2 centuries? And the seminar had a negative side and a positive side. The negative side was, as many of us recognize, the master narrative of how this works, which comes from Eusebius in the 4th century, just doesn't work. If you read the first paragraph of Eusebius' ecclesiastical history, he says Jesus gave the truth to the apostles. The apostles gave it to the bishops, and we have it. That's really the kind of Christian myth. And so you can trace the apostolic succession all the way along. And that's what Eusebius does. That becomes his master narrative. And heresy comes in and messes things up. Then you have to fight the heretics, and on you go. Until glorious Constantine, sees the truth and everything works out as planned. We just thought that was a fantasy, frankly, a fairy tale. And we wanted to kind of try to tell the tale in a different way. Part of the problem with telling the tale is Constantine has a Eusebius has a unified narrative. So you have a beginning and an end. We don't. It becomes a mosaic. There's no master narrative. There's no one way to tell the story. What you have is a huge amount of variety and experimentation. Diversity isn't a strong enough word. There's a lot of experimenting going on. These people are trying to figure out what the heck is happening and what does this mean. And so what we tried to do was explore that experimentation, tried to show how that was happening and how you fit it together into some kind of what we think of as a mosaic. And we got pieces missing. We have to always kind of admit that there's a lot of pieces missing, but you can begin to see the patterns of something that is there. And the patterns are really very exciting to see because they give us a way to think about what these movements looked like. And you have to use the plural, what these movements looked like in the first 2 centuries and what the possibilities were. It was not inevitable that we get to Constantine or that we get to Nicaea. Nothing was inevitable about that. History is a series of accidents. So it could have turned out differently. And this lets us see that, frankly, it could turn out in a lot of different ways. One of the things that impressed me in the book was the book argues in something that's pretty well accepted among most New Testament scholars today, that the form of social location, of social formation in the first 2 centuries is the common meal. That's where these people really find who they are, and that's where they experiment, is around the common meal. That's the one of the things that disappears in the 3rd century. The common meal goes away. So if you want to argue there's an essence, the one thing that every one of these groups does disappears in the 3rd century. That's a massive argument against there's some essence developing here. And as somebody who comes from a Catholic tradition where the sacraments are important, to realize that the meal is not the path to the sacraments, that's a huge intellectual lift for me, but it's the right argument. And it then makes me think about all of these kinds of things. Probably the thing we do in our church today that is most like what goes on in the first 2 centuries is the church supper. That's probably the thing that is most like what went on in these communities. So we worked 10 years on this project, meeting twice a year, commissioned papers to do it. And then 3 of us, Hal Tossig, Aaron Vacom, and myself, we wrote the book. We took all this stuff together and created the book. And it is the seminar's report, even though we're listed as the authors.
So in the introduction to the book, Sue Monk Kidd says that it's a book that has the potential to rewrite history. And you've touched on some of those things, and I think that interesting experiment around the difference between reading history backwards and reading history forward, which really shifts the way that this work has been done. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean,
We've just lost Brandon.
but you have to also construct a story out of it. You have to make a fiction of it in some way. And that doesn't mean it's not true. It's just you got to get it in some kind of order in order to make sense of it. And there's two ways to think of history. You can think of it, how did we get to where we are? In which where we are determines what you sort out to get there. Or you try to get in front of everything and say, what were they looking at? They didn't know where any of this is going. And so it's not inevitable from their point of view. Historians talk about the fallacy of the inevitable, that it has to turn out this way. No, it really doesn't. It can turn out a whole lot of different ways. And once you get into that point of view, you can then begin to see, oh, they're playing with this, they're playing with that, they're trying to experiment. Some experiments work, some experiments don't work. It's a kind of backwards and forwards. And that makes it kind of exciting because I think we're rapidly entering a similar kind of situation in where we don't know where we're going. So we better start experimenting. And the 1st and 2nd century offer some clues about how that might play out.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. Greg, I'm really interested to hear your response to the book. What was most significant about it for you?
Well, I was really looking forward to seeing the report, the book. I knew it was coming. I hadn't been able to participate in the seminar work because of distance, but I knew what was coming and I stayed up with some of the papers. So it wasn't so much that the findings were surprising as the different way in which the findings were being reported. It wasn't the kind of, in a sense, top-down, facts-based kind of report that we've seen in some of the earlier things like the 5 Gospels or the Acts of Jesus or the John the Baptist report or whatever. It was much more, of a mosaic. It was snapshots. And it almost, there isn't a master narrative in the book because that's the whole point of the data that they're working with. But it basically presented a whole lot of information to the reader, but it doesn't actually tell the reader what to make of it. It's not pushing a particular reconstruction. And almost every church history document and every PhD dissertation on that period has already worked out what the point of the research is going to be. They're trying to demonstrate something. This book isn't actually trying to demonstrate something positive. It's not trying to construct something. It's rather just bringing all the pieces to the table and inviting us to see all the pieces, but also to see them differently. And it took me a while to adjust my reading expectations to a different kind of a text that wasn't so much didactic as unveiling and showing, but then there's this and then there's that. And I had to sort of process it as I went along. So while most of it wasn't brand new content, the way in which it was being presented for me to digest was delightfully different as a process for learning and inviting other people, myself as a reader included, into the process. So it wasn't, we've got it figured out, this is what you guys now need to hear. It was, well, this is what we've been working with. Where is this going to take us as we all process it? And I thought that was really great. Very different kind of report.
Sorry, Brandon.
Well, that's what made it so hard to write.
Yeah, I imagine so.
It's really hard to write when you don't have a beginning, a middle, and an end. As Aristotle said it. And when you think there's no master narrative, then you have to convey to people meaning, but without forcing them into some, trough or tunnel that they have to go this way. They have to be able to see the variety of the detail that's there. You're right about anybody who's been following this material for the last 40 years should not be surprised. We don't dig up any new things from the sand. We do bring a lot of things to the table that have been marginalized, or, I think this is the first kind of book that really tries to look at all of this kind of material in one place. That is an original contribution, but we're not digging up any new stuff at all.
Yeah. But even the way you are naming some of the familiar material, like the chapter on bathing practices, until I started reading it, I didn't realize is what other scholars would call baptismal practices in the early church. But to talk about bathing practices and to talk about the town bathing pool just reframed for me all that stuff which is in the early material about baptism and other bathing initiation practices. But it also made me think again about the Qumran community and their incredible investment in bathing facilities in the desert, which it wasn't something that got pulled into this conversation, but I started joining dots from other parts of my work and going,
it's actually in the chapter before we edited it out, but
there you go.
It's another sign of the Jewish character of these groups. These groups view themselves as belonging to Israel in a kind of fundamental way. And we have a whole lot of Christian vocabulary from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century that makes things in the 1st and 2nd century look like they're 3rd and 4th century things, but they're not. And bathing is a good example of that. Bathing is very different than baptism.
Oh.
Although the Greek is the same.
Well, it's transliterated, as you said.
The way you transliterate it, and then you avoid the problem. You have the same problem with Eucharist. I mean, there's a whole series of these issues that are tied up in translation problems.
Brandon, you stressed earlier on, that idea that there's not a Christian movement, in these times, but there's this sort of disparate collection of Jesus groups doing, some things the same, but some things quite differently. Can you give us a sense of what these groups might have looked like? Some of the differences and the ways they functioned and met.
Yeah. There's a huge linguistic problem here. We want to use one term for the whole group, and it doesn't work. That's why the term Christianity does not apply to the first 2 centuries. There are no Christians in the first 2 centuries. You just have to quit using that word, and it goes away. What you have are various kinds of groups, and you can think about this at a basic level. How large were these groups? Probably the largest group would be 30 people. Most groups were 10 to 20. Paul tells in 1 Corinthians that they should gather all the people together to hear the letter. We have a good idea of what a large room would be in Corinth. You could get about 30 people in one. So that's about 3 years of work in Corinth. He converted 30 people. That's not a massive missionary program. You have to really kind of change your point of view. Estimates are that by 185, there were probably 160,000 of these people in the Roman Empire. That's a minuscule number, given the size of the Roman Empire, close to 40 million. So it's a very small group, and they're engaged in small activities. They organize themselves in a variety of different ways, and paying attention to those organizations, I think, is important. A big way that Christians organize themselves was in schools. And the word mathetes, which we translate as disciple, a kind of another one of these ecclesiastical words, means students. That's the most common word for these people. That's what they call themselves most commonly in the literature in the first 2 centuries, is students. So school model is a very big model. It's not the formal schools we engage in, but it is discussion clubs and that kind of thing. It's a lot of argument going on and a lot of teaching going on. And that's a fundamental way in which they organize themselves. They also organize themselves into fictive families. A lot of them have real problems with their real families, and you get a lot of stuff in this material about breaking away from your family and forming a new family. And those are anthropologically called fictive families, but those family structures are real and they're important. And they form these kind of fictive families. That's another way they organize themselves. They organize themselves around associations, which is a standard form of a voluntary organization in the Hellenistic world. The ecclesia is an association type. It belongs to a larger genre. It means a gathering. You should really talk about the gatherings of the anointed people or gatherings of the Jesus people. But church is not a good term for that. It's another one of these ecclesiastical words that then gives you a false idea of what's going on. These are clubs. The association is a type of club, and it's a mutual aid club. It takes care of you. So they have these variety of ways in which they organize themselves, not one single way. And they kind of shift and move around as they figure out what to do.
And so, one of the really interesting things is thinking about this strange time that we're in now. And Janet, in the comments, suggests the parallels between that time and that strange shifting time that we're in now, where we're in a time of change and experimentation. What does this period in history have to say to us at this time in our history?
I'm a historian, not a prophet. Okay, I was trained to look firmly into the past, and I hardly ever look into the future. I'm just trying to be honest. And for me, when it gets past the 5th century, it's positively modern. I have a weird time scale. I don't want to go into the story of my life, but I grew up Roman Catholic and was massively influenced by Vatican II, and still consider myself massively influenced by Vatican II. And I consider it to have been betrayed by the popes that came after. They just simply cashed in on it. The problem today is Christianity is in I think, terminal decline. I just don't see that it has much future. The pension funds will keep it along for a while, but it's just losing. In the United States, none is now the largest group. This is a country that in the 1950s was 90% church going. It's a huge shift. Canada is even more extreme than us. I don't know the Australian numbers. And we have this illusion that somehow we can get back to the way it was. Repristination is always a mistake. You can't get back, you can only go forward. What the first 2 centuries say to me is it didn't have to turn out like it did, so try again. And I mean, that's a kind of simple message, I'm sorry, nothing profound about it, but it doesn't have to be a certain way. There's nothing that I've said this for years and it upsets people, but I'll say it again and upset them again. Jesus wasn't a Christian. Paul wasn't a Christian. So why should I be one? You ought to at least ask the question. If you pretend to be a follower of Jesus and of Paul, and they weren't Christians, maybe you shouldn't be too. Maybe you need to rethink how this plays out. I know that's threatening, but paddling the boat in the same direction isn't getting us anywhere.
Greg, I'm interested in your take on that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, just to put the two life stories side by side, my background was very different. I was brought up Churches of Christ on the north coast of New South Wales, which is Disciples of Christ Christian Church bracket disciples in US talk, but a very fundamentalist expression of that tradition. But the essence of that tradition was what is called Restorationism. And the big idea of the American founders of that movement a couple of hundred years ago was that we could get back to a form of Christian unity, category error, of course, but we could get back to a much desired thing called Christian unity if we just went back to the quote, the New Testament pattern. end quote. Now, of course, I very early discovered in my theological studies and then my subsequent advanced studies at university that the New Testament pattern is actually diversity. There was not a single template which Peter and Paul and James were all working from. Coming through very different ecclesial experiences, and as somebody who's about to step aside from kind of professional church leadership, the challenge has always been to me is how do we rediscover enough of the diversity to find the particular recipe, the particular combination or whatever, which is relevant to the times we now find ourselves in. I have a beautiful cathedral in Grafton, but it's entirely and consummately inappropriate for doing Jesus work in a town of 15,000 people, who most of whom have no background with college or university education. But we have a fine musical tradition in the best classical English church music tradition. The cultural misfit is phenomenal. So yeah, for me, this kind of research is both an invitation and a compulsion to get back and to not to go back actually, but simply to experiment where we are and find valid ways of living the legacy of Jesus in the context we happen to be in at the moment.
Brandon, I'm interested. Was there a particular part of the seminar that was most exciting or most refreshing to you as you sort of unpacked this work and discovered these mosaic tiles, or was it the way they kind of fitted together at the end of the work?
It's a variety of those things. One of the most intriguing things to me in the seminar's work was the work on gender bending. When you start to look at what's going on in the first 2 centuries as experimentation, one of the things you begin to see they're experimenting with are sexual roles, and that there's a lot of it from the very beginning. And it's much more, I mean, I think when we first started using the category gender bending, I was in the hesitant group because it's a term that comes from queer studies, but actually I think it's the right term. It is technically the right term. That's what they're doing, is they are bending the categories of gender. And you can see this in Paul. When Paul says there's neither male nor female, he's bending Genesis. He's really, that's a radical statement. Some of them took him seriously and went further than he wanted them to go. So then he's got to try to, figure out where are the boundaries. You see that going on all the time. You read something like Paul and Thecla, which is written in the about 150, something like that, about the same time as the pastorals, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And there Thecla is converted by Paul. They try to martyr her twice, but twice she's saved. She's a good example of wants to be a martyr but can't make it happen, and so she gets to be on both sides of the martyrdom question, which I think was one of the reasons why this writing was so popular in the 2nd and 3rd century. She cuts her hair. She wears male clothes. She preaches. And she forms a fictive family. She's doing everything. And it's a complete bending. Then you read Titus, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, and they have the exact opposite. They don't want any gender experimentation. They want strict Roman, paterfamilias values. So you see both things going on in the 2nd century at the same time in groups that are related to Paul groups, that belong to these kind of Pauline groups. It's unfortunate, the oddity of the New Testament is the New Testament itself is a 4th or 5th century document, but it contains documents from the 1st and 2nd centuries. So the documents from the 1st and 2nd centuries that don't fit the 4th century perspective, they don't get in. And therefore it skews our picture of what that period looks like. So, you know, in our book, there's no New Testament. There's no canon in the first 2 centuries. There's no proto-canon. There's no secret canon. It's just not there. And writing isn't all that important for them. They're much more into storytelling than they are into writing it down. And so, you know, our literary sensibilities, and you're talking to a dyed-in-the-wool literary. I mean, I'm a trained text guy. I bleed text. But that's not what's going on in the first 2 centuries. That's a really later phenomenon. And we forced the first 2 centuries into this textual mold because that's the evidence we got. And it's harder to find the other non-textual evidence, but it's there.
Before we get to a couple of the questions in the chat, Greg, I wonder for you if there was one thing that intrigued or surprised or you were most pleased to read in the book.
I think a bit like Brandon, it was the gender bending information, but even putting that label on it made me kind of move out of some comfortable spots and go, really, what's going on? Is this a bit twee? What are they doing there? But the more I read into it, the more I could see the argument, agree with the argument. The other thing, which was a sort of a belated affirmation for me, was it made me realize that what I'd been doing with my own doctoral research into the origins and early development of the Antichrist myth was exactly an exercise in this, trying to read the history forward, because the powerful scholar I was disagreeing with, Wilhelm Bucer, had taken the established doctrine of the Antichrist and he'd found it supposedly popping up in Jewish documents back in the 2nd and 1st century or even earlier, BCE. Well, he found fragments of ideas which much later on were elements of the Antichrist. But every time he found a fragment, he'd found the entire Jewish Antichrist legend. Well, that was a walk-home PhD dissertation in a sense. I just had to deconstruct the position of Bucer. But I realized after reading this report through that, in a sense, that's exactly what I was doing. And that's exactly what lots of historical research does. You put aside the established formula from the 4th, 5th, 6th century. You go back and you look at the pieces of data in their own right. And you say, so what did the people who spoke about Belial or who spoke about the end time tyrant or whatever, what were they thinking? Because they probably weren't thinking Antichrist. So what were they thinking? And then you try and see how these ideas develop, flourish, some of them die out. So it was a very similar process and it was happening inside these same groups. This was one of I would now, of course, go back and say, well, these different Jesus groups, to the extent that they all saw themselves as defined by Jesus, still an open question. One of the things they were doing was they were playing with different ideas about the antithesis of Jesus. If Jesus is the anointed, what is the opposite of that? And how is that experienced in power, in empire, in heresy or division or argument or opposing points of view? So I found it kind of, although I haven't worked in that space for decades, it was kind of a sort of belated affirmation that actually, yeah, that's how we are best to research the 1st, 2nd century BCE, CE, where put aside the later framework and go back and read the data in its own terms, in its own context, and then trace the movement forward through time rather than backwards. So even that core methodology, I found from my own work, I could affirm that as a really effective and important way of talking about the 1st and 2nd centuries.
Thanks, Greg. Got a few questions coming in the comments. I wonder, Adrian Skelton, if you want to unmute yourself, Adrian, and talk a bit more about your question about empire.
Thank you, Jeremy, Brendan, Greg. The question I had was around what did link these groups together, and the answer in the book seems to be that it's resistance to empire, and therefore that becomes the supreme irony when it's the empire that takes over the disparate groups and turns it into Christianity. It's a slightly uncomfortable question as well at this time, because there is a resistance going on in all our countries, a resistance to government and vaccines. So we're seeing the power of that resisting association. I just wonder if you've got any comment on that.
Well, within the seminar and within its debates, the resistance to the empire and how to phrase that question was one of the most contentious issues. Because that really does take on, there's a whole bunch of people who want to see these early Jesus movements as being pacifist groups. They're not revolutionary. We don't have any real evidence of them fomenting revolution. But the evidence seems to be that one of the things they have in common is resistance to empire. Now, you also need to say that's one of the things they also have in common with Judaism. Because Judaism is resisting the empire and has been resisting it for quite some time. So part of resisting the empire is belonging to Israel. That gets you in that category. And as soon as you announce that Jesus, here's another one of these, I'm going to drive you all nuts about translations issues, but I think it's a fundamental problem. If you use the term Christ, most of my students always thought Christ somehow meant the divinity of Jesus. It doesn't. It has nothing to do with that at all. What Christos actually means in the Greek is anointed, which means the Jewish Messiah. So every time you say Jesus the anointed, you're saying Jesus the anointed, the Jewish Messiah who Rome put to death. That's what the whole phrase means. Now you can cut it down to just Jesus the anointed, but all of that's implied. You can't talk about Jesus without talking about how he died, and that brings you immediately into conflict with Rome. So resistance is built into the movement. And even the most conservative of a group, like 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, who by the pater familias and many of the values of the empire still want to resist the empire. They still see it as evil. So that is a characteristic that runs through the group. And oddly enough, it runs through the group well past Constantine. It still stays in the group after Constantine. Most of the martyrologies that we have were written after the martyrdom stopped. It still became a primary way of understanding who it was to belong to this group. You stood against Rome, even though Rome was now on your side. It was more the bishops who were buying the Rome on their side because of the benefits it brought than the average folks. The average folks were much more resistant. So it's a very complicated issue, but it's a very important issue. I want to point out one thing. You raised the issue of resistance here. Yes, you can see how resistance is powerful, how it's influential, and how it's inspiring. I would like to point out, it's one thing to be a resistor in a democracy, and it's another thing to be a resistor in an empire. One is relatively, you get a free shot. In the empire, it's risky. You can end up dead. That's unlikely to happen unless you get COVID in our situation. So.
Thanks for that, and thanks, Adrian, for your question. Shift focus a little bit. Sue Grimmett has asked about Eucharistic practices. So, Sue, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thanks, Jeremy. I was intrigued, Brandon, by a comment you made at the very beginning about the tension you felt in seeing that there wasn't this sort of continual movement from that common meal that all the diverse communities shared to the Eucharist or to a Eucharistic table practice. And I guess sometimes it's always assumed in rhetoric that there was this move across, that meal became this. And so I just would like you to unpack that disconnect you saw.
Yeah, how long have we got? Yes, you are right. The assumption has always been that there was just a transfer from the common meal to the altar. But the altar is a fundamentally different thing. The common meal takes place in a house with a family and a community where everybody is reclining. So it has a very specific social location. I want to stress that. That's important to see. It has a very specific social location that gives its meaning. An altar takes place in a temple. Whether you call it a temple or not, you have now moved it somewhere else. And that social location is defined by sacrifice. So that's a fundamentally different social location, which gives a very different meaning. You still see in much of the artwork in the 5th and 6th century meal practice where the altar is in the background and the people are being fed in front, not at the altar and not off of the altar. That artwork is really important to look at because it's pointing out that even in the 4th and 5th century, the meal eating part, while still cut down, is still taking place, but it's not associated with the altar. The Eucharist moves to the altar when it becomes identified as sacrifice. And that's in the late 5th century. And that, in my mind, fundamentally changes the character of what's going on. That's a whole different ball game. So you can see the transition. Several scholars have argued why the shift from the common meal to the altar. And the reason seems to be numbers. There got to be too many of them. And you couldn't have these small common meals. 15, 20 is one thing. 200, that's a whole different ball game. As some of you may well know, and that changes the social location and actually changes the meaning. So it becomes a fundamentally different thing.
Thank you. Shifting again, Susan Jones has a question about gender bending and some of the changes there. Susan.
Yep. Thank you very much. This has been fascinating. I had never thought of it as gender bending, but I kind of knew that the role of women, for example, was different in earlier times. So what was the pressure that made the change when they got into the 3rd, 4th, 5th kind of era? Or pressures would be better to say.
Well, it doesn't happen all at once. I mean, there's conflict going on as early as Paul. Paul is Paul's a good example to study this problem because Paul himself is in on the gender bending pretty far. He's not in on so far as to allow the man to sleep with his mother-in-law. That's where he draws the line. But he's allowing a lot of other stuff. As the communities get larger, you begin to get other kinds of problems. Some people think women should not be allowed to speak during the community services. Paul's all for that. The pastorals are opposed to it. So you have a very set gender roles within the Roman Empire and within Judaism. Although Judaism is also bending some roles, but not as much as these folks are. These folks think they're in a new creation. And when you get a new creation, you get to reinterpret Genesis. And Genesis, The rabbis read the Genesis text as God created a male and female in his image, that God was bisexual. That's the way the rabbis read the text. So it's a very different view of God, and they start experimenting with this. So this is all going on over a long period of time. But the longer it goes on, the stronger the social pressures get to be to revert back. It doesn't happen in a moment. It doesn't happen in an instant. You can see at 150, the Acts of Paul and Thecla and the pastorals are arguing each other. There's other places you can see it. For example, at the end of the Gospel of John, in chapter 21, the hero of the resurrection story are not the apostles. They're hiding in the upper room. It's not Thomas. He gets it wrong. It's Mary Magdalene. But the tradition has completely wiped that out. See, so everybody thinks Thomas is the hero. Thomas is the butt of the joke. He thinks he's got to touch and feel. That's not a spiritual reading. That's a materialist. So these things go on for a long period of time. There's a lot of experimentation. And a big part of the problem is that once the church becomes male and buys into the Roman, really paterfamilias model, it shuts this stuff down. Now, it doesn't completely shut it down. You still have nuns. You still have, there are clearly as many female monks as there are male monks. It's just we think all monks are male. But that's clearly not the case when you look at the evidence in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century. Even in the 5th century, Benedict founds a male monastery. His sister founds a female monastery. What we remember Benedict, and we don't remember his sister. See, so this stuff is more complex. Even when you think it's shut down, than we give it credit for. And that's what history does. He says, look at this stuff again, open it up, see where it's going.
Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. Lorraine Parkinson, you had a question that kind of follows on from that space in a bit, but I wonder if you want to talk a bit more about your question.
Yeah. Oh, where'd I go? Yeah, look, I'm me, me. Sorry, I don't know why my name didn't come up in that question I put there. Brandon, thank you for your wonderful book. Now,
it's not mine, it's all three of us in the seminar, so
I know.
Don't give me the credit.
You're the one I can thank. Now, in my own writings, I've made big assumptions about all the editorializing of 1st century texts that went on before they became the canon, as we know it. And so I'm wondering how much of the 4th century editors you can see they're altering and adding and subtracting from those 1st century writings, so that they become, they read in accordance with the developing doctrine at the time.
Yeah, that's a really good question to which I don't have a great answer. We have a good idea, I think a fairly solid idea of what the writings that are in the New Testament looked like textually at the end of the 2nd century. And Bart Ehrman has done, if you want to see, he's done a number of programs like this on YouTube. They're actually very good. Bart's a very good text critic. And we have a good idea that we have no idea before the end of the 2nd century what they really look like. It's anybody's guess. Now, some people say, they thought it was sacred and they preserved it. The earliest manuscripts we have, if you take P56 as the earliest manuscript, and it's not it's just a little fragment from John. It's written in a very poor hand on a cheap piece of papyri. It's not sacred text, and it's not a good scribal hand. And it has differences from the text of John we have that we now see as the canonical text. So hard to tell. I think scribal practices got much better in the 3rd century and very good in the 4th century. But even then, you get a lot of it's hard to copy. It's just not an exact science. But I think we have a reasonably good idea of what the text looked like at the end of the 2nd century. Now, on other writings, like the Gospel of Thomas, we have a good idea what the Gospel of Thomas looks like in Coptic in the 3rd century. And we have some fragments in Greek from the late 2nd century, about the same age as P56, by the way, about 150 to 185. And they look pretty good. The Greek fragments look reasonably close to the Coptic. So, but you're always guessing. I mean, the other thing is, we assume things should be stable because print is stable. Okay, we work with printing press assumptions all the time. They're just born into us. They're wrong for the ancient world. There's a letter from Atticus to Cicero, and he's gotten Cicero's new book. And the first thing he does is correct it. Now, he hasn't even seen the darn thing, but he's making corrections in it. So what does that tell you about it? There's no original text. It's fluid from the very beginning. Now, how fluid? But yeah, it's a fair question to which I do not have a very adequate answer. That's the best answer I've got.
Thanks, Brandon. Thanks, Lorraine. We're coming close to the end of time, and I guess I wanted to hear from you again, Greg. If you were commending the book to people or a parish or whatever, what are the things that you would want people to take away from it?
I guess I'd want people just to shift their thinking and begin to imagine the Jesus movement in a different way from the headline story from Eusebius. And when we're doing, those of us who did theology classes, we did church history, and we probably had one lecture where we heard about the Montanists and how wacky they were and how extreme they were and how unrepresentative of the valid Jesus tradition the Montanists were, even though Tertullian, I think it was, becomes a Montanist. And yet it strikes me that actually the Montanists might be a really good exemplar. I don't know how many of their texts we actually have, but the way Tertullian supports them and encourages them and so on, while others are critiquing them, that would seem to me the Montanists are a bit of data that's been sitting there in plain view for a couple of thousand years, but we've taken it as evidence of the opposite. They were the deviants, whereas the official story is the correct story. Well, let's look at the stuff that's been there. It's been available to us, but it wasn't part of the canonical narrative. And so we just didn't pay attention.
Thanks, Greg. And Brandon, a final thought to leave us with as we all rush off, and those who haven't bought it, buy the book. What's your takeaway for us?
I guess my takeaway from this has been, this is an odd thing. I've been doing this kind of work for almost 60 years now. And I remember the first time I got exposed to form criticism, and my fellow students said, "Oh no, this is terrible." And I said, "Wow, this is wonderful. Look at this." It's like, wow, this is great. And I kind of been there ever since. I mean, it's to me, the hunt is worth it, because you see how creative these people were and how they struggled with things and how they don't know the answers and how they're really figuring it out. There's an illusion that there is a fixed Christianity. There's never been a fixed Christianity. It's always been an experiment. And it's still experimenting. We just think our version of it is the one that's fixed. But in point of fact, I just finished rereading again Peter Brown's The Rise of Christianity in the Western World. And he argues that Chalcedon didn't work. It never settled the Christological question, and then we've been experimenting ever since. Well, I think he's right. It's always an experiment. We just want, the orthodoxy is the illusion, the mishmash is the reality. That may not be very reassuring, but I think that's the right way to look at it historically.
Brendan, I think that's a terrific note to end things on, that idea that through this work we discover variety, and that sense that it's never been orthodoxy versus heresy, as you say, but this great variety that has always been part of the tradition. And for those of us who muddle our way along trying to stay within the tradition, it's a great relief to find that we are part of this incredible diversity that has always been, and that it's very simplistic to reduce things to that binary of orthodox or heresy. And so this opens things up in a really exciting way for many of us. So thank you so much for giving us some time today, and thank you to Greg for your time. It's been a terrific conversation. It's a terrific book, and I really encourage people to seek it out and buy it. I'll send out a link to a recording of the conversation once we've had a chance to tidy that up. Someone asked for some of the chapter headings for the book, and so I'll copy those into that email with the link so people can get a real sense of the material. There's some good stuff on the Westar Institute website, some details about the book and some details of other ways to engage with the material in the next few weeks through February and beyond. So it's certainly worth having a look at those things as well. But thank you all for joining in this morning. It's been terrific. I wish you all well and peace and safety in these really interesting times. So thank you very much to all of you, and particularly to Brandon and Greg.